Humanity has experienced many plagues in our history, from the Black Death that killed a third of the world's population and half of Europe, to the Spanish flu of 1920 that killed 3% of the human population, which equates to between 50 and 100 million people. Now the world has its eyes on a new virus, a virus coming from Wuhan, China. This massive city of 11 million inhabitants is more than the entire population of Portugal, and it's only considered to be a moderately sized Chinese city. Although the origin of this virus has not yet been determined, there is one market suspected of being the source, a wild animal market that sells dogs, bats, snakes, and cats. And although the media has called this a deadly outbreak, it is not as lethal as it is made out to be. In fact, the mortality rate is around 3%, and compared to the SARS virus, it's not as deadly as this past outbreak had a mortality rate of 18% in 2003. However, the particularity of the current coronavirus is that it is severely contagious, and according to scientists, it could even be transmitted during its incubation period, making it possible for people to transmit or receive it without having any symptoms appearing. The H1N1 influenza pandemic that occurred between 2009 and 2010 affected an undetermined number of people in the millions. According to the US CDC, between 150,000 and 500,000 people perished during this pandemic, which would equate to between 0.001 and 0.01% of the world population. While the figures doubled in a matter of hours with over 8,000 confirmed cases and 200 dead at the time of the recording of this video, it is clear that the virus follows an exponential growth. About 8,000 people had SARS in 2003 during the height of the pandemic, and 800 of those people didn't make it through, with a death toll of 297 in China alone, with 5,000 confirmed cases. What implications will the appearance of a new and more contagious virus have on the Chinese economy? And how will the country's leadership act moving forward in comparison to the last outbreak? These are the questions that we'll try to answer today. Let's begin. The rumored animal origins of the virus includes rats, snakes, and bats in the city of Wuhan, China. Currently, experts have been able to deduce that the virus was originally transmitted from an animal to a human at first contact, and then the virus mutated to be able to transmit from human to human. So what was the animal that caused this virus? Although it is uncertain, scientists have been leaning towards bats. The conditions of the wild animal market was not only unsanitary, but the wild animals being sold were actually banned to be sold in public markets. And although the first cases were known to have developed in December, it is presumed that the infection had begun as early as October or November, but it wasn't until December that the number of cases exploded. This situation is similar to what had happened when the SARS broke out in 2003, when the authoritarian Chinese leadership tried to camouflage the figures and the seriousness of the situation. They did not spread information quickly enough, and due to that, it had quickly killed 800 people, including 250 in Hong Kong, with the highest number of deaths per capita. But the China of 2003 is not the same as the China of 2020. Just to cite an example, in 2003, Wuhan did not have either a metro system nor high-speed train lines. Now, Wuhan has more than 9 underground lines with 250 stations, and the city was further interconnected with the rest of China via air, rail, and road. The explosion of this current epidemic coincided with the Chinese New Year celebrations, the biggest celebration in China, which was the perfect opportunity for a new virus to spread. So with this more interconnected China and its connection with the rest of the world, the Chinese government made a decision that they did not make in 2003, and this was to quarantine not only the entire city of Wuhan, but the entire province of Hubei, which encompasses a population of about 50 million people, comparable to the entire population of Colombia. This was a decision that evidently impacted the entire world, and decisions made in Beijing is greatly sacrificing its own economy and growth by isolating the 6th most populous province in China. China had decided to cancel many New Year celebrations, the cancellation of the Winter Olympic Games, and a group travel ban to China, even with the blocking of travel permits to Hong Kong. The Chinese government is currently making efforts to build 2 hospitals in under 9 days with a capacity of 1,000 people each. But even with these new hospitals, it would not be enough for the already confirmed number of infected patients. These actions by the Chinese government will help prevent an unbridled contagion. But that does not imply that the virus has not already spread to other countries, including France, Germany, Japan, the US, and a total of more than 60 other confirmed cases outside of China in countries such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Malaysia. Experts believe that there could be up to 100,000 people already infected in China. Recently, the mayor of Wuhan offered to resign his position by admitting that more than 5 million people had already evacuated from the city despite the quarantine imposed by the Chinese government. Videos have already been leaked on social media of desperate situations, with bodies on the streets and sick people being taken by force and trucks filled with dirt, blocking Wuhan's access to the outside world. China had taken different measures in response to the SARS outbreak in 2003, such as blocking 55 million Chinese citizens from exiting. But on the other hand, there are certain actions that they did not change, such as the little information being published by the government, despite the fact that they have admitted that the virus has mutated, making it more contagious, describing the situation as very serious. It is precisely this fact that makes this the toughest test that President Xi Jinping will have to face. Although the new coronavirus has a mortality rate that is 10 times lower than SARS, its infection rate is much higher, and there still exists the possibility that the virus could become more dangerous as it evolves. Estimates place that the rate of infection is currently at 2.6. This means that for every person infected, about 3 new people can be affected as well. In that sense, Ebola, for example, had an infection rate of between 5 and 7. And according to several analyses, the coronavirus could have a potential rate of infection of between 2.4 and 5. Since it is still a relatively new virus, it is still too early to know the exact infective capacity that it has. Statistical projections show that the virus can double the infected in a matter of days with an exponential rate of infection. According to the mathematical trend, up to 200,000 people could be infected by the end of February if the contagion does not slow down, with an estimated 8,000 deaths, which would represent a mortality rate of 3%. But of course, this is just a pure mathematical model. In reality, no virus is perfectly exponential because of the measures taken by the affected countries, such as quarantines or additional measures that slow the spread of the virus. By closing off most affected provinces, Beijing hopes to contain the outbreak of the virus, but this requires the passing of a strong bill by the Chinese government. The handling of the crisis has been praised by some and criticized by others, but the fact that China is not a democracy, but an authoritarian regime gives it greater power to restrict the freedoms of its citizens. For example, the quarantine of more than 50 million people in efforts to curb this outbreak. However, in more traditional democracies such as France, Canada, or Australia, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve what China has achieved in the case of an outbreak of a comparable scale. The main stock exchanges of Asia, as well as New York, has all gone down. All of this in response to the fear of the coronavirus and Beijing's ability to contain the situation. It is especially the Asian markets that have had the most cases. For the moment, there are no cases of the coronavirus in South America or Africa that we know of. But knowing that it takes time for the symptoms to appear, it is still a possibility that the virus might make an emergence in these regions. It is still too early to know the true potential of the virus, but the drastic actions of China shows that perhaps there is something that Beijing knows that the rest of the world does not. But the seriousness of the situation has already been demonstrated. Many streets in China are empty, especially in Ground Zero, Wuhan, where the public transport system has ceased operations, shops have closed down, and there is a limited supply of basic goods. The entire population of the city has no choice but to wait for the end of the quarantine. However, the hermeticism of China does not allow the spread of information of how the situation developed. This is comparable to the hermeticism of the Soviet Union when the Chernobyl nuclear tragedy occurred. Initially, the Soviets attempted to reduce the importance of the accident until it became a real threat for almost the entire continent. During this situation, the Soviet Union acted in an authoritarian manner in attempting to limit information of the severity of the accident, even after it had learned that the nucleus had already been exposed and radiation levels near the fission reactor could kill a person in a matter of minutes. The Soviet hermeticism caused the mortality rate to be higher than it should have been due to the fact that the accident had not been contained in time, since the Soviet had rejected Western aid due to ideological reasons. In fact, Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, had said that this incident was one of the drivers of the collapse of the Union, as it had forced the Soviets to use its resources and systems to its maximum capacity. At the moment, everything indicates that the coronavirus will have a greater amplitude than the SARS, and China, being the second world power, greatly reduces its economic and industrial activity if the virus begins to affect more and more victims and becomes a global pandemic, it would seriously affect the economic growth of China, which is currently at its lowest point in the last 30 years. Surely in the coming weeks and months, more cases will continue to be discovered, and the secrecy of the different affected countries will begin to increase as well. So, is there anything to worry about right now? Given the situation, we can't say that this is insignificant, as more than 50 million people will be in quarantine. Multiple countries are reinforcing their borders and taking evasive measures. At this time, there is not much information about the virus, and as time goes on, we will know if we are facing the next great pandemic or a different version of SARS. At this time, there is limited information and the virus can evolve in the coming weeks. This virus can end up either being controlled like the SARS or H1N1, or it could be a new kind of pandemic that the modern world hasn't seen before. So with that in mind, just remember that the common flu kills 400,000 to 800,000 people every year, so don't panic just yet. So what do you think? Do you believe that the Chinese government is purposely hiding the real figures of the infection? Do you think your government does enough to prevent the spread of this new coronavirus? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you like this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this every single week.